Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita government and public affairs. Broadcast on Sundays on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1 at 8:30 and then 4 o'clock, and then repeat of the weeks before episode at 4:30 p.m. But you can also find Wichita Liberty TV on my website, that's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org. Find show notes for episodes, all the old episodes, plus all the other content that I and others create on nearly a daily basis. So today we have our co-host Karl Peterjohn here, and we're going to be wrapping up, or well, at least continuing with some of the coverage of the Kansas primary election last week. Before we get started, just a quick update. Last day to register to vote is October 17th, and then our general election will be on Tuesday, November 6th. So Karl, last week when we left off, we did not know who would be the Republican nominee for governor. The race was very close, but then this week there was some results and then an announcement.
Well, rather remarkable too. It was quite a contrast with either one of the local races here that's gone to a recount, even though this local race, the percentages spread is much wider than the governor's race, or thinking back to 2000 when we had the hanging Chad controversy and 500 vote margin down in Florida between then Vice President Al Gore and then candidate Governor George W. Bush.
So the announcement was, well,
of course, we know that Secretary of State Chris Kobach has been declared the winner by a few hundred votes over our current governor, Jeff Collier.
So the governor had hung on, thinking that on Tuesday, our two largest counties, Sedgwick County and Johnson County, would release their final vote counts after the canvass. And it was thought that Collier, or at least he probably thought he was pretty strong in Johnson County, but actually after Johnson County, Chris Kobach picked up more votes than Jeff Collier did in Johnson County. Shortly after that, I think the governor saw the writing on the wall. He had a press conference in the evening, and really a pretty gracious one, I think. And he said, we're not going to contest this anymore. I endorse, I think speaking for his lieutenant governor campaign, we endorse the Kobach and Hartman ticket. And Thursday of this week, they're already having a joint campaign event.
Yeah.
So
it's rather remarkable because the contrast with some of the other elections, I think it speaks well not only for Governor Collier, but I think the whole process in terms of the counting for the provisional speaks well for the county clerks and the 4 election commissioners who actually have to do the heavy grunt work of conducting the election here in Kansas.
Although I think in Johnson County, they were very late reporting the results on election night.
Actually, they reported the next morning.
Yeah, and I think that people are not happy. Because this was such a close race, it really exposed a lot of things about, well, what do you do when a voter comes and says this or that, and sometimes a lot of confusion. And I know I wrote conversing on Facebook with Russell Fox, political science professor at Friends University. He said, most elections are not this close. Fortunately, that if there are some mistakes, it's not going to affect the outcome. And he said, yeah, that's right. But there can be very close elections, and so people say, well, that means every vote counts. And, Karl, the cynic in me says, well, the fact that these very close elections are so uncommon says to me that your vote usually does not really count.
And we're in a situation where I can't think of an election that had been as close on a statewide basis since, and all the time I've been in Kansas, going well back into the last century.
Yeah, or really any states probably. These extremely close elections like this are uncommon, and the governor had every right to do what it looked like he was going to do, to hire some lawyers, to contest every vote in every way. Chris Kobach kind of sat back and was kind of magnanimous, saying things like, well, I'll accept whatever happens. But, he was in the lead, and it's easy to be, magnanimous when you're in the lead, right?
I can speak from experience. That's easier. But in terms of close elections, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out, like, for instance, up in the great state of Minnesota, they had a U.S. Senate race that was down to just
Norm
a few
Coleman
hundred
and Al
votes.
Franken, right?
Exactly, and they literally pulled a box full of ballots out of the trunk of a car, and all of a sudden, and they just happened to be about 90% for Mr. Franken. So they sent a comedian who had some other problems to the U.S. Senate for a while.
We always joke here in Sedgwick County that we're always looking to see what the Keachai Cemetery vote's going to be if anybody's voting in there. But I think, and we're going to talk about this in a later segment, that there is a recount going on right now as we speak in Sedgwick County, and I think we have a lot of confidence that it's a pretty a good process. So, Karl, we're going to take our first break for a commercial here, and we'll be back in just a moment.
The petitioning, while it's an important task that has to be done, it's secondary to completing the election and making sure that, especially because we've had close contests, whether it's locally, like in our 4th District County Commission race, or statewide for the Republicans in the gubernatorial primary, they've got these close elections that have to be put to bed.
So I think we should look at changing one of those dates or something to give a little bit of leeway there, so that all this doesn't happen at once. But there is another independent gubernatorial candidate, Rick and Nathaniel Kloos, Kloos. That's a father and son team from Topeka. They did file a successful petition some time ago. They have a website. They're on the Secretary of State's list of candidates for November. So there's going to be 5 choices that voters have come November.
I think that's going to be a very unusual circumstance. I can't recall the last time in a general election ballot. Now, there's plenty of primaries where there have been lots of candidates, but for a single office. But to have 5 tickets of governor, lieutenant governor for 5 different tag teams, so to speak.
Usually there's just 3, the Democratic, Republican, and then in Kansas at least, the Libertarian Party does well enough that they have automatic ballot access each year.
Yeah, so they've been able to retain minor party status under Kansas law.
That's the usual thing. And there's all sorts of calculations going on that who does Orman, one of the 2 independents, let's say, who has raised a great deal of money, who is a person of means himself, who has already shown that he's willing to spend a lot of his own money 4 years ago when he ran against Senator Pat Roberts as an independent. The calculus, and I don't think of it this way, but they say, who's he going to draw votes from the most? Is he going to take them from the Democrat Kelly or the Republican Hartman? Is he going to be the spoiler? I don't like to use those words, Karl, because I think that every candidate has to earn their votes, and there's no such thing as stealing votes from somebody. They're not yours by right.
Well, it's going to be Kobach or Kelly and or Rogers and Hartman for lieutenant governor, and those 2. But when you're looking at this, Bob, the voters are the ones who make the decisions, and I think it's kind of it's inappropriate, but it's part of the problems that sometimes some members of the media and some members of the political establishment have in terms of saying, well, it should just be an either or, a binary digital type of choice, as opposed to more of an analog where you've got different voices speaking out in different ways. And I frankly think it's a little bit refreshing to have multiple candidates so there's a broader set of choices. Having said that, it's going to make it a lot harder for the pollsters and the pundits to kind of do their handicapping for the race, which I think is positive too, because maybe we can talk about issues.
Exactly. I mean, who cares what the polls think? And I've always wondered, Karl, why are we so interested, and why do we give so much weight to what people from Poland to think about these elections?
Well, I appreciate the humor, but
you're right. So much of the
we don't want to get into Polish collusion, because that could lead off. I'm afraid we'll let the national folks talk about the Polish collusion.
Right. So much of the campaign coverage is the horse race, which is easier to do, and people do find it interesting. But you're right, Karl. We should be talking about what are the things that Chris Kobach believes. What does Laura Kelly believe? What is their vision? we're going to try to get all these people on here. We've had many of the Republican candidates on. Now we'll switch over and seek to have some of these other candidates appear on Wichita Liberty TV before the election, and we'll try to avoid the horse race, and let's ask him, what do you think needs to happen in Kansas?
Well, we've got major issues in terms of, obviously, always taxes and budget, but issues relating to
schools.
Well, improving education is critical, but in addition to that, whether it's roads and highways, whether it's a host of social issues. I mean, we've got a whole host of abortion-related legislation that's sitting in front of the Kansas Supreme Court, and they've been sitting on it for a long, long time.
And also, very importantly, the Kansas economy is in the doldrums, no doubt about it. So,
nationally, everything's moving along quite well.
Exactly.
And
so what's wrong, and what are we going to do about that?
I think getting, especially South Central Kansas, moving again, Bob, is going to be, I think, the top issue, at least for local elected officials, and I think the candidates for governor, too.
Okay. Well, let's, after our break here, let's turn our attention to some local races that are of interest. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be right back. Welcome back again to Wichita Liberty TV. Bob Weeks and Karl Peterjohn, your hosts today, looking at some of the results from the Kansas primary elections and what's going forward to the general election. So, looking at the Sedgwick County Commission, of course, you having been a member of that body, there are 5 members, and 3 of those members or seats are up for a re-election this year. In District 1, which is east and southeast Wichita plus the rural areas, the current incumbent, Dave Unruh, retiring, and in the Republican, there was just one candidate, Pete Meissner, Wichita City Council member, and the Democrats were represented by Renee Duxler, a young woman who's a mother of 3, a business owner, and has been a social worker in the past. So no primary contest there, but those 2 move on to meet in the general election.
I'll correct you on one little point. This district is northeast Sedgwick County as well as east Wichita, so it includes like Bel Air and part of the city of Keachai. Part of Keachai, because of the interesting and unique boundaries up there, part of it's in the 4th District that Commissioner Ranzau's contesting, and Hugh Nix and Ms. Cruz, and the rest of it's in District 1.
So, I think that district has an advantage to the Republican in terms of registration.
Yes, it's a heavily Republican registration district.
But we just don't know what's going to happen there. Now, District 5, which is a little bit of southeast Wichita, but Derby is really kind of heart and center of District 5. Mulvane, yeah. Jim Howell is finishing up his first term there, a former member of the state legislature, then ran for council. Republican he is. There was no Democrat, but there is an independent, Jim Skelton, who was on the Wichita City Council for about 6 years, then served overlapping some with you on the Sedgwick County Commission. Entirely for 1 year.
No, for one term.
One term. Declined to run 4 years ago, but has now filed a successful petition as an independent. So it's going to be Jim Howell and Jim Skelton in November.
Yeah, I can guarantee you that the winner in that district is going to be named Jim.
Well, what else can you guarantee us, Karl?
Well, it's going to be a very interesting contest because you've got 2 former and current commissioners, so they know how county government in Sedgwick County is working. I think the challenge is going to be that Jim Skelton is going to have to be able to really put together some compelling reasons why he wants to return to the county commission and what the current incumbent, Jim Howell, has done wrong.
And it's worth noting that although Skelton is an independent in this race, he had been a Republican when he ran for office, and just a Republican. So
he had run, but he had been censured by the party, and that had made for
because of his support for Democrat Tim Norton on the thing there, in District 4, which is northeast Wichita from about Woodlawn west, I think, more or less.
Woodlawn or Oliver.
north central Wichita, and then up through Mays, Valley Center, those areas.
It has
up
a little
through
bit
there.
of
Park City.
northwest Wichita, but you're right. Valley Center and Park City, a little bit of Keachai, and all of the city of Mays.
So the incumbent there, finishing up his second term, almost 8 years, is Richard Ranzau, guest on this show a number of times. The Democrats had a primary, Lacey Cruz, a young woman, versus Michael Kennard, who's run for office a number of times. And Lacey Cruz run that pretty easily, 57% of the vote. Now over on the Republican side, Richard Ranzau running for his third and what he says will be his last term, against Hugh Nix, who is kind of a newcomer to politics, although been involved in civic life. That race was dang close. And after the canvass on Tuesday, which is, as we talked about last week, which is the county dealing with the provisional ballots and everything like that, it turned out that Richard Ranzau led by 75 votes, 50.5% to 49.5%, so a 1% margin.
And while this is a low vote total, the total votes cast in the primary were a little bit less than 7,000 for both candidates. So even though 75 votes is close, it's percentage-wise, it's a wider margin than, say, the Collier-Kobach race.
Right. So candidates have the ability by law to request a recount, and that is what Hugh Nix did. He deposited a $1,000 bond, which if that's not really paying for the recount, because if something were to happen and he would win, he would get that $1,000 back. But if the result does not change, then he does lose that $1,000.
That's the case. However, I would point out with the current election machinery and past experience where they've only had one recount, but the one recount they did not change a single vote. It stayed exactly the same. So I hate to go out too far on a limb, because at this point, while we're taping this program, we really don't know what, if any, votes will change on it.
Yeah.
But that is one race that has to be resolved by the recount process and should be done sometime, should have been completed sometime Thursday.
Yeah. Well, let's continue with that in just a moment after we take our final commercial break on Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back again to our final segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. Bob Weeks and Karl Peterjohn here. So talking about this Sedgwick County Commission race, District 4, Hugh Nix and Richard Ranzau, Republicans, fairly close. Nix did request a recount, putting up $1,000 that he may have to give up. And we do know someone monitoring this process. Our friend John Todd, who's been a guest a number of times, is monitoring the process on behalf of the Ranzau campaign. And you know, here's how it's working from when I talked with John last night, after they had started maybe about half a day's worth of work. There's all these paper ballots, because in Sedgwick County now, when you vote on a machine, it prints out a ballot on some fairly thick cardboard. It's not paper like a paper receipt from a grocery store. And the important thing is it's human readable. In other words, it's going to say Sedgwick County Commission District 4 Republican, and it's going to say either Hugh Nix or Richard Ranzau based upon who you voted on. So humans, after they vote, can look at that and see that. Also, the recounting clerks can do that as well. So what John told us is that there's a whole bunch of boxes of these paper ballots. They take them out by a precinct. They go through them and separate them into Republican and Democratic piles. The Republican pile is then split up into Nix and Ranzau piles, and maybe write-ins if there are any, I don't know.
Yes.
And then those numbers are compared to the counts that the scanning machines produced on election night. And John tells me this is really impressive because they are very serious and studious about this, the workers. Tabitha Lehman, the election commissioner who's been on here, is not part of this. That's the law. Her deputy is supervising. But John says that they do not put a precinct away until they have verified that the hand count matches the machine count. And I think you talked with John this morning where they've done even more, and still there's been no discrepancies found.
Well, they had one other very close election where they did a recount and literally no votes were changed. But this is with the current equipment that's being used. And Bob, this is one of the challenges because you've got to get the election workers familiar with the equipment. You've got to make sure there's no defects in the equipment too. And so everything has to work out well. You'd mentioned earlier that Johnson County had struggled on election night because they weren't able to produce their returns until the following day. We've had problems with this in other places in past elections, but I think it speaks well for Sedgwick County that everybody managed to get it wrapped up and the unofficial numbers were provided and completed, and the process, I think, worked fairly smoothly. It's going to be interesting to see on this recount what, if any, votes would change. Now, you mentioned write-ins. I would be very surprised if there weren't at least some write-ins. I know in the past, for instance, 2016 for president in November, there were a lot of write-ins.
Yeah, from the general election, I looked the other day, the write-in votes there were 1,200 pages of write-in votes with maybe about 50 names on each page. So there are a lot, but they would not count in favor of either Ranzau or Nix. Although I asked John Todd, I said, what if someone did a write-in and wrote in Hugh Nix or Richard Ranzau, even though their names appear on a check mark? How would that happen? Or how would that be dealt with?
Well, I'm not exactly familiar with state law on how to do it. One of the challenges they've had, if you have a write-in campaign, is this a vote for candidate, I'm going to use my example, Karl Peterjohn, or is it Karl? What happens if they spell Karl with a C instead of with a K?
Yeah.
Or they make Peterjohn into two words?
They want Peterjohn without the Marxist tinge on there is what they wanted there. So yeah.
Well, I mean, which votes, do you count those votes or not?
So this is the challenge that election officials have, and that's why I guess it's good news that close elections are fairly uncommon where these types of things might actually make a difference. But it also tells us that, you know, the election office has only just a handful of elections each year, usually two big ones, but then there's also little tiny school district elections and stuff like that. So it's not like a bank where they have to gather all the data and reconcile it at the end of every day. This is something they do just a handful of times a year. And there has been some thought that there could be some problems with the voting, and there are people who are calling for an audit of the paper trail, and that's essentially what's happening in Sedgwick County District 4. I mean, there's going to be a winner, Ranzau versus Nix, and I think there's no secret that we support Richard Ranzau. That's good news that he will almost certainly prevail. But it's also very good news, I think, that it looks like there's been no discrepancies between what the machines reported and what the hand count is reporting as well.
Well, I hope that's how it turns out, because the credibility of the election system, you don't want to have a hanging Chad situation.
Right.
And there's the old line from Joseph Stalin that he didn't care who people voted for, he only cared about who counted the ballots.
Oh, I thought it was Tammany Hall who said, I don't care who does the voting as long as I do the nominating.
Well, that's
different.
But there's a key difference there, Bob.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think that the recount is going to give us some confidence going forward that our election office is being accurate in these, and even though when it's a real close race, we can have confidence that what they report is what actually happened.
And I think that's necessary. If we're going to have a democratic republic where people's votes count, we need confidence in that system that the citizens are casting those ballots.
Very good. Okay, Karl. Well, there's still a lot more we could talk about that District 4 race, but we're going to have to put that off to some future episode because today we are out of time. So for Karl Peterjohn, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again next week.